All right. Looks like we can get started. This is so exciting because we have so many people here. I'm excited to get started on this topic, and we have a great group of people here to talk about how we can sustain movements for justice through government. Just to kind of give a little overview, my name is Jam, and I am the director of the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations. I'm going to be leading you through the the PowerPoint. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering today. We're going to talk about your panelists, who you're talking to, and what organizations they work for, so you can understand where we sit in the context of this whole conversation. We're going to give a little bit of an example of, we're talking today about policy, but we can also talk about, what is the difference between policy and programming. We're going to give a few brief examples, legislative examples of how policy change came to be. And then we're going to give kind of an in-depth dive into a case study and identifying a problem, talking about how the policy was developed, supported, and proposed. We're going to talk about what barriers to access exist and what solutions there might be and what solutions might be possible in the future. And then we're going to get into a little bit of a workshop session so that we can, take a problem that you as our participants come up with, that we can kind of think through, okay, we have this problem, what are some ways that you could address it with government partners or non-government partners to get to a solution that could work for the community. And we'll have some time for Q&A. Just to talk a little bit about the Zoom platform, so we're all in a Zoom meeting together. If you have anything that you wanted to ask us, please feel free to put it in the chat. Some of the questions we can address in the moment, and some we might address later. But we're keeping an eye on the chat to make sure that your questions do get answered to the best of our ability. Um, just to say a little bit about community standards, of course, this is a place where we all can show each other mutual respect as we go through this process together. I think, not much more needs to be said on that. But if you do have any Zoom related problems or problems related to community standards, we do have somebody in the chat named Summit Moderator. So if you have a problem, you can chat them directly. If at some point you're not able to use the chat to communicate, you can unmute yourself. But as a practice, I would say probably keep yourself muted while you're not intending to speak. And just again, thanks everyone for being here. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to myself, and I'll let the rest of our panelists take it away. Again, I'm Jam. I'm the director of the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations. If you haven't heard of the Commission on Human Relations, essentially what we are is a civil rights enforcement agency for the city of Pittsburgh. So any person who feels like they've been discriminated against on the basis of a protected class, things like race, color, sex, sexual orientation, we have a list of 15 protected classes in the city of Pittsburgh. Any person in the city of Pittsburgh who feels that they've been discriminated against in their housing, employment, public accommodations, or the use of city services can file a complaint with our office. We then investigate it and try to determine whether we can see that that discrimination occurred. And at the end of the process, there can be, different outcomes, including mediation or, the finding of damages. We also do education and outreach, and we are charged with making sure that Pittsburghers know what their civil rights are. So that's our office. I'm going to hand it off to Councilperson Strasberger.
Thanks, Jam. Can you all hear me today? Okay, great. I want to thank all the participants for coming out to this session today. My name is Erica Strasberger. I am a member of City Council representing District 8, and one of the many things here in Pittsburgh, council members don't just work on policy development, they work on a lot of other aspects of serving the residents of the city, but policy development is one of the things we do. And in doing so, as you'll hear in this session, work closely not only with partners within government, but partners within sort of pseudo government. And so, whether that is a board authority or commission, which might not be City of Pittsburgh proper, but is related to government. And then also, obviously, members of the community and members of organized groups within the community. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but I think all of those types of groups are in the sphere that I work with.
Thank you, Councilperson Strasberger. And then next up we have Sister Janice Vandernack. Sister Janice, if you can unmute.
Oh, yes, I see that. I'm so sorry. Good morning, everyone. Yes, I work with the Latino immigrant community in Pittsburgh. Casa San Jose opened our doors in 2013, but I've been working with Latino immigrant folks here in Pittsburgh since 2003. So during that time, almost as soon as I began the work, I realized the need to interact with government, federal, state, local, because so much of an immigrant's life is influenced daily, on a daily basis, by government. And our role at Casa San Jose, besides providing connections and social services, is advocacy. And so organizing is another key piece of what we do at Casa San Jose. I am now considered the director of civic and community engagement. And the goal of that, of course, is to get immigrants involved in doing just what we're talking about here. Advocating for just policies, working with government partners to see that they come to some solutions. So I'm happy to be here with you today.
Thank you, Sister Janice. I think next up we have Jordan Fields.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jordan M. Fields. I'm excited to be here today. I'm a policy coordinator in Mayor Peduto's Office of Equity, and I've had the privilege of doing a lot of legislative work over the past few months. So I'm excited to share with everyone today.
Thank you so much. And then we have Alaa Muhammad.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. Some familiar faces and new faces as well. My name is Ala Muhammad. I am a policy coordinator who works alongside Jordan for the policy shop at the Office of Equity within the Office of the Mayor. I also work closely with Faye, who you will meet next, on the Welcoming Pittsburgh initiative, which is kind of a community engagement arm of the mayor's office that focuses specifically on immigrant and refugee and newcomer populations. So I'm really excited to dig into the conversation today to kind of explain how these different parts of government interact with, work with one another.
Thank you, Alaa. And then we have, last but not least, Faye.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Faye Shala Akintola, and I am excited for our conversation today. So as my colleague has mentioned earlier, I'm the Special Initiatives Manager for Mayor William Peduto, and I have the pleasure of managing our Welcoming Pittsburgh initiative. And the whole idea of the initiative, the way I like to phrase it, is our immigrant and internationals integration strategy in the mayor's office. And the whole idea is we know that unfortunately minority communities tend to be left out of conversation. So this was a specific plan of making sure that the voices and the lens of immigrant and refugee communities are reflected in everyday government. So I look forward to diving deeper as we go on.
Thank you so much. So yeah, we have a great, diverse panel of different people from all across your City of Pittsburgh government. So I'm so glad everyone can be here. In this slide, we're just talking a little bit about, policy versus programming. Both of these can be used to address problems that are affecting the community, but they are, different in some ways, and there are some areas of overlap. So we have, Faye to talk a little bit about, welcoming Pittsburgh and how that's played out, and then also Sister Janice to add a couple of examples of programming solutions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jam. So just talking a little bit about Welcoming Pittsburgh. So again, it's something that was launched in 2014. And our current model, right, is we bring together different stakeholders. I think what's great about our work is we don't pretend to know the answers. So what we do is we work with different community partners. One that you would get to hear is Sister Janice just shortly. So we bring different community partners from service providers to leaders in our immigrant communities to kind of help brainstorm again, what is the best way to be able to mitigate current problems in the community. What's great is we're starting from a roadmap. So there was a Welcoming Pittsburgh roadmap that was launched in 2015. And this roadmap is made up of 37 actionable strategies that pretty much say, what does it look like for the city of Pittsburgh to be a welcoming place, right? And it lists all of these different recommendations, some that are programmatic or some that are policy focused, right? So I'll give you an example. So some of the things that are more program-like is, how do we host job fairs, right? Specifically for our immigrant communities. How do we celebrate our immigrant heritage, right? Our cultural heritage with the community. How do we host and revitalize our sister cities network, right? From different countries, the partnerships that the city has kind of stemmed on. So those are more examples of programs. Now, some of the policy focus is more like, how do we institute a language access plan in city government, right? Again, the whole idea, like I mentioned earlier, I would say my job is to make sure what are the barriers that prevent our immigrant communities from interfacing with government, right? From getting their problems answered, right? So again, language access is what component of that, right? If you can't communicate with government and government can't communicate with you, well, you're pretty much stuck, right? So again, an institutional policy example is language access. Another is one that finally we just will start working on today is the idea of a cross-cultural training, right? How do we make sure, again, some of our immigrant communities that are coming from different parts of the world, and I will use myself as an example, as a Nigerian, government is not something that you interface with, especially when you're talking about police officers. That is the last person that you think is willing to help you. Right, but now we know we have immigrants, we have refugees coming from different cultures and different places, and our job is to make sure, how do we do a better job of making sure that we build bridges between our public safety and our immigrant communities. And one thing that our former steering committee kind of said was, hey, how do we make sure we create a cross-cultural training, a training that would give our public safety, our fire, EMS, and police the tools that they need to better interact, right, with our immigrant communities, right? So if you would respond better if you actually know the person that you're speaking to, right? You will come with more compassion rather than anger, right? If you understood that, hey, you know what, when you're pulled over, and again, using my example in Nigeria, you get up and you have a conversation, right, with the police officer, right? As you all know, here in America, that is the least thing that you do, right? So how do we then give our police officers the tools so that they understand the community in which they're interacting with? Not just on that level, but also the tools in terms of a language card, right? Tying back to language access so that they know, hey, if this community member is speaking a different language, I have access to a telephonic interpretation number that I could call. I have an interpreter right on the phone to help me interact with this resident, right, with this citizen. So those are more examples of a policy focus. But like I mentioned, our job is to bring together stakeholders, to bring together community partners so that together we work to solve some of the recommendations down the roadmap. And I'll pass it off to Sister Janice as being one of those trusted voices that has been a part of Welcoming Pittsburgh since it started.
Sister Janice.
So sorry about that. I'm so prompted to think about the beginnings of all of this as Faye is talking about the wonderful accomplishments we have achieved here in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County regarding government relationship to immigrants. When I started this work, as I said, in 2003, one of the key factors in government's relationship to immigrants was the fact that 9/11 happened. And that really colored government to be suspicious. And it trickled down through every level of government, and meaning local, and police who are an arm of local schools at that time even. And so we who worked with the Latino immigrant community really found our folks, our undocumented folks, being labeled terrorists. And in those days, police saw it as their patriotic duty to round up these folks and get them out of our midst as soon as possible. So conditions create the necessity, right? So, and when you're undocumented, you're very, very afraid to use your voice. You want to keep hidden as much as possible. So that's why it was a key role of ours in those days to be advocates. And we had to interact a lot with schools and with police. And our interaction with the City of Pittsburgh Police started almost immediately, and our interaction with the mayor's office. And over the years, we kept chipping away at it and working at it, and found very listening ears among council persons, city council persons, the mayor's office, the police chief. And so we were able to come to the place where we really have the policy that we have today. For example, calling ICE. I remember once a woman called me desperately from her cell phone and said, please come and help us. The police had surrounded her, she and her friend, and also a woman, and children in the back in children's car seats in the back of the vehicle. They were stopped and surrounded by police. They were terrified. I was desperate to communicate to the police. It just was not a good situation. But that situation, me being there and being able to speak on their behalf, speak English on their behalf, and have channels to go to the chief of police to be able to talk about how these persons were treated, that meant all the world. And that sort of was a beginning of our work in creating a more culturally sensitive government and police here in the city of Pittsburgh. Another thing that had been happening until the last presidency put a stop to immigrants coming in, was the growing numbers of immigrants here in our region, and with their presence becoming more and more obvious in neighborhoods, in schools. We were growing in the need for more attitudes of welcome and neighborliness. This last 4 years has been just a nightmare of unfriendly policies and rhetoric that also trickled down even within neighborhoods, rhetoric like go back to where you came from, build that wall, written on school chalkboards by kids who were encouraged by the rhetoric that they were hearing. But a steadfast continual growth here in our city, in our county, of immigrant-friendly policies on government, as well as the Department of Human Services of Allegheny County. So we have seen, because people have been increasingly able to have their voice heard, and a key piece of that is organizing. A key piece of working towards policy and programming is organizing among the people.
Thanks, Sister Janice. Yeah, so those are two really great, or a lot of really great examples. Shared on the policy side. Example of a policy. The police officers carrying a telephonic interpretive card, and then on the programming side, Sister Janice shared Casa San Jose as advocates, as part of their programming. Two different types of solutions, but two solutions addressing similar problems. One policy and one programming. We'll move on to the next slide. So this, kind of represents part of the framework that we're going to be working with today. And this just identifies a couple of the phases you might be able to see in policy change. The first stage, of course, is that a problem exists. It exists almost always at the community level, though it can exist in other levels. We identify that the problem exists, and then there is the question of, barriers to access. How do we then get the decision makers to know the problem exists? um, Once we are able to get to that phase, and decision makers are looking at the problem, we understand how the problem is built. What are its root causes? What is causing this problem to occur? Which then leads us to say, how do we address that root cause? How do we develop this policy? How do we then get people on board, and who gives us feedback into the policy? And then finally proposing this policy so that it can become an actual policy that is affecting change. So I have just, two examples. We talked about there are two pieces of legislation that I know about from my experience with the Commission on Human Relations that we'll talk through. The first is citizenship status and preferred language. So walking through these stages of policy change with that policy, we know that there was a problem. We have a national origin protection in the city code and federally. However, we know that discrimination still took place based on a person's citizenship status and preferred language. So there wasn't adequate protection to an existing law. In terms of getting past that barrier to access, I would say, Casa San Jose and Welcoming Pittsburgh played a big role. Casa San Jose as an observer of the problem, being able to communicate with Welcoming Pittsburgh, to get that problem to the level of policymakers so that they could convene stakeholders, people in the community, people who are able to make decisions and create this policy together, with work from policymakers, legislators, from the Commission on Human Relations, working together with the community to create a policy that would work in Pittsburgh. And then finally, passing that legislation onto the legislative level with a legislator partner, Councilperson Strasberger, to get that policy proposed to City Council. So in this case, for this piece of legislation, it went from the community to community organization to a government liaison between the community to departments and legislators, and then finally to City Council. The next one we're going to talk about, also passed in this year, was the Crown Act. And this one has a slightly different path to how the problem became identified and how it was passed. This policy, it came about from people, analysts in the mayor's office, looking across our country and seeing that other states, other cities were passing the Crown Act because of an existing problem. If the problem exists in one place, it can also exist here in Pittsburgh. So analysts in the mayor's office looking at that policy and saying, okay, how can we bring this here to Pittsburgh to protect Pittsburghers? And then from the mayor's office, working with the Commission on Human Relations to develop the policy to make it work in the Pittsburgh context with our unique factors, and to create a guidance that once we create this policy, how are people going to follow it? So after that, it came not from the city council, but actually in this case, the mayor's office proposed this legislation to city council for them to vote on. So we have two different, sets of paths for these, but ultimately they both resulted in legislation that added protected classes for our city. And these are two, different examples just to kind of give you the idea that policy change can come about through different stakeholders from different communities into different departments and with different legislative partners with the mayor's office, with city council. But there are many ways to access policy change in the government level.
And Jam, before we move on, I was wondering, someone in the chat is asking, what is the Crown Act? So maybe you or Jordan could help explain that.
Sure. Jordan, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, I can take that. So CROWN stands for Create a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair. And it's a piece of legislation that's been passed across the country, and even at the federal level, the House of Representatives passed it in early October. And so the Crown Act basically prevents against hair discrimination, which is something that a lot of racial, cultural, and religious minorities experience in public accommodations, housing, and employment. So oftentimes when someone applies for a job, right? Say someone's applying for a new position, their employer might try to enforce a grooming policy or a dress code that prevents certain hairstyles associated with their religious or cultural background. So for myself, I have locks. Some employers have banned locks in the workplace, which we know that's a natural form of hair presentation, especially for Black people. So that piece of legislation bars natural hair discrimination.
Yeah, and I'll just add what's interesting about the Crown Act also is that it talks about protected classes that already existed. It talks about race, religion, and other protected classes that have something specific to do with hair, hairstyles, or the ornamentation of hair. However, the problem was that although somebody could file on the basis of race, it didn't necessarily get specific enough to give them the full protection. Someone could say, well, I hired this person. It doesn't matter their race, but I need them to have their hair relaxed because that's what we have to have a consistent, look across all of our employees. So that example is where one whatever person had said that would be arguing against, this isn't race, this is hair discrimination, and yet it is race discrimination, but it's not as specifically protected as it needed to be. And so the Crown Act adds that specificity that prevents discrimination on the part on the that provides a specificity that prevents discrimination against those specific qualities of hair. Somebody asked, does it apply in schools? I can answer that briefly. So what I will say is that in terms of the Crown Act, because it is protecting protected classes that already existed, is already illegal. However, the city of Pittsburgh has the Crown Act. To my knowledge, the state of Pennsylvania does not have a specific Crown Act. And so the state of Pennsylvania is where you would file a discrimination complaint against a school for school students because they are the ones who run the Department of Education. So you would file that complaint on the state level, not with the city's Commission on Human Relations, but I would say that natural hairstyles are protected in schools. I can say that confidently. All right, those are good questions. So I'll move on to this next slide. This kind of just gives us grounding us in where we are in a policy cycle. And we talk about policy as a cycle because, we may start from a problem and develop a policy and implement it, but that doesn't mean that it's completely done or perfect. We still need to evaluate the policy, and then there may be a problem within that policy's implementation, and then we repeat the cycle. So right now we're going to be talking about identifying problems and building them and how to access government to do that. But there is still more to this whole cycle, and we can continue to work on things until they become as perfect as we can make them, which will take forever, which is good because we want a constant engagement of citizens in the community in the process with the government to create the policies that will work for them. So we're going to dive into our case study today. We're going to talk about community and police relations. We're going to identify some problems here, and we're going to see what possible solutions there are and what organizations we could work with to identify them. So our panel, we're gonna talk through this with you, and we're gonna create this in front of you so that you can see what a process could look like. And we've kind of predefined a couple of the problems, and we actually talked about them a little bit earlier. So we talked about, immigrants and refugees don't have the same access to law enforcement protection. And then we have another problem. Officers make decisions without understanding the citizens that they're protecting in their communities. I don't know. I think Sister Janice and Faye both gave really good examples earlier. Faye gave the example of in Nigeria, you would, if stopped by a police officer in your car, get out of your car and have a conversation. If you did that in the U.S., that would not be received well, and officers may not know that is why someone's getting out of their car. Sister Janice gave a great example of someone saying that they were. I'm not sure. Maybe Sister Janice, if you want to repeat the situation, somebody had called the officers, but when they called, they had become surrounded and they were extremely
Yeah.
fearful.
Yeah, the officers initially stopped them because they had a expired sticker on their car. Sometimes we see those things as profiling because many times they don't pay attention to the inspection sticker. But when they see drivers who don't look, well, white, they sometimes would concoct reasons to stop them. So they originally stopped this family, and the family called me because they were desperately frightened. And in those days, as I said, their immediate thought was these people were bad, they're terrorists and possible terrorists, and they might have a bomb in this van. This is where it escalated to, this high of a level of escalation of thought. And so I tried to intercede because, of course, the women in the van did not speak any English and the police did not speak any Spanish. In the end, they didn't call ICE, but that's what we have been dealing with up until this most recent administration, the presence of ICE anywhere and cooperation with ICE. The city of Pittsburgh police, because of policy, don't cooperate with ICE, but all throughout Allegheny County, there are dozens, literally dozens of police force that we have not had the opportunity to interact with. And sometimes this happens, that police immediately call immigration when they see a person, stop a person who is speaking another language and can't produce a valid driver's license. So that is the continuing problem. But I see great hope with this present presidential administration because of how he wants to create policy, immigration reform and pathways for those who don't have documents. But here in the state of Pennsylvania, we very well could. We have total authority here in the state of Pennsylvania to pass a legislation and a policy that would give driver's license to not only the undocumented, but immigrants who don't fall within the categories where they're allowed to get a driver's license in the state of Pennsylvania. And we're still working on that, but of course that is state.
So from our conversation so far, I think I've pulled out a couple of root causes for some of these. For disparate access for immigrants and refugees to law enforcement, I think fear of ICE definitely was one. And then no access to ID or driver's license for some. Any other root causes of what causes disparate access for immigrants and refugees to law enforcement protection?
Hey, Jam, I think one that came to mind, and I know that people ask this question a lot about the difference between a sanctuary city and a welcoming city, right? And as Sister Janice could probably speak to this, but people used to ask me a lot, why aren't we a sanctuary city? And I had to explain that sometimes actually does more harm than good, right? And the fact that I remember my colleagues even in Philly saying, once the past administration elevated and spoke about Philly being a sanctuary city, I mean, it increased the amount of ICE presence in that city just because they use that terminology, right? So I think even with us, with welcoming, what was great is the importance of staying in contact with community, right? Because then is in Casa San Jose, they were like, we're actually okay with not being labeled that, right? We don't need the negative attention, right? That comes with that, right? So it's sometimes, again, you hear different policies going on and we think, oh, it's applicable to us, but I think it's important that you know the landscape in which you're working with, right, to see if that's something that matters to the community. So I would say one of the problems is sometimes not knowing if that policy that's passed in another city is applicable to yours, right, and just going for it.
And I would say in that example, from a legislator's or an elected leader's point of view, you know, that's where you can sort of butt up against public pressure. So as an elected official, you're very susceptible to public pressure, and you get a lot of people who might not work in the space that, you know, members of this panel work in, but care, and they see what's happening across the country and they say, we want you to pass a sanctuary city bill, pass a sanctuary city bill. We just want to be a sanctuary city. And it's, you know, that's when you have to, you know, listen to the people who are actually experiencing the problem and the root causes of the problem. And this is what we did. We listened to people like Sister Janice and those in the community experiencing the discrimination and understanding that we can do sort of everything, but maybe sanctuary city status is not the most protective, even though it sounds good on paper and would be, you know, helpful for carving ourselves out as a progressive minded city.
And all the while, we were very vocal with city council and the mayor's office about how we wanted in every way possible for there to be no cooperation in local police acting like immigration enforcement officials. It is not their job to determine whether a person is undocumented or not, or has legal status or not. It's just their job, if a person's driving without a license, to give them a ticket. And so that's what policy said.
So then for officers making decisions without understanding the citizens and community, we had one root cause. Officers were unaware of cultural practices. Are there any other areas officers are unaware? Perhaps there's something regarding training. So that maybe that training for officers didn't include culture of other communities.
And if I could also add one thing, I think oftentimes there's a lack of communication between communities themselves and law enforcement officials that kind of creates a barrier between the two parties and leads to a level of, I want to say, like cultural incompetence, if you will.
Yeah.
Just to like also add on to that, I want to clarify that not like when we say immigrants and refugees, I'm sure all of us know this, but it is worth saying it's a very big bucket of people with a lot of different experiences from literally every corner of the world. And how they got here, the story of how they got here also differs across the board. So there are immigrants and refugees who are documented, who could, fit all the, law enforcement checks, but maybe because of how they look or because of, I don't know, whatever it is that day, a law enforcement official will choose to stop them or target them, and many things can escalate. So I just want to say, like, the lack of communication is not just as a result of language barriers. There are many immigrants and refugees that can speak English fluently. It's just that when we say lack of communication, it can be language barrier, but it can also just be lack of engaging with the community. What does it mean when the people who are protecting a community do not know the community?
Mhm. Yeah, I think I wrote in the causes of the problem that we're a diversity. Of course, that in and of itself is not a problem. but it is related to the problem that officers. So I'm rewriting the statement so that we can include what is causing the problem in that what the problem is. So I'm writing officers make decisions without full awareness of the diversity of the citizens they protect.
And I don't think it can go without saying that we need to make sure that the people who are serving in the roles of, protecting the public are the right people. And that gets into hiring, which gets to be complex and maybe not something that is a policy solution, but um, we certainly want to be mindful of and work toward ensuring that those who are in these positions are public servants or public protectors that have a service minded or protector mentality as opposed to a warrior mentality. And that's something I wanted to acknowledge as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Um, that's definitely a good point. I'm thinking of if I can put it in the problem statement. Officer,
Acknowledging that it's, again, it's a complex issue and challenge to get through, and not necessarily something that we can pass through, that city council can pass as policy, but just wanted to state it.
yeah, I think officers make decisions without full awareness and of the diversity of the citizens they protect or tools for compassion. Um, and this is not stating all officers, but even even one officer who could be in this situation is a problem. Um, so as we restate the problems, we're thinking, what are some of the solutions? And I think that also addresses what Councilperson Strasberger had mentioned. One of the solutions could be selection of officers. Needs different standards. That could be one solution for this first problem. For either of these problems, disparate access for immigrants and refugees due to law enforcement protection due to fear of ICE, language barriers, and access to IDs, or that officers make decisions without full awareness. What are some of the solutions that we can come up with here?
Yeah, the access to IDs, the on various committees that I'm a member of, one of them being Welcoming Pittsburgh, we have been considering what's called a municipal ID. So people could have an ID that would be acceptable to their particular municipality's government. And that's filled with, pros and cons. So now as I look towards this new president that we have and the things that he's going to be enacting, we might not have a need for that. But meanwhile, it still exists as a potential possibility as of what we have going on right now. We do still need some kind of acceptable ID for persons who have only their passport from their home country as their ID.
Yeah, so municipal ID is one that could address this problem directly. I think Faye actually mentioned the telephonic interpretation cards, as that could address language barrier. Any of these?
Right now, there's nothing to address fear of ICE. I just can't even think what we could do to address fear of ICE. By their very nature, they don't interact with the public, and they don't accept or feel that they need to listen to their effect in the community. So it has to come from the executive branch of the federal government.
From the perspective of a police officer, it's something that they can do to prevent, people feeling that if I call the police, ICE is going to come.
Well, that is so, we had such a fabulous example of what can be done. Early on, when the Trump administration was sending out ICE to deport as many people as possible, and our families were being broken up by deportation, we had quite a number of police officers come to a community meeting, City of Pittsburgh police officers, and we had several hundred community members present and at least 6 officers. And they stated to that group of people, we do not enforce immigration laws. We are here for the City of Pittsburgh residents to protect and serve. That was so incredibly impactful. It was just wonderful. So those kinds of events, which I know the police have been doing, I don't know if that's policy or programming, but police have been having, well, before COVID, coffee clatches in neighborhoods where the police could come and people could come and meet the police at a coffee house and things of that nature.
There's a comment in the chat. Please, I believe it's from Natisha. Please correct me if I mispronounced your name. It says, "What about the mobile trauma groups?" I just wanted to maybe.
I'm not sure what the mobile trauma groups are. Does anyone else have a, you know,
Well, there was a group, they had this van, I forgot the name, but I know it was a mobile trauma group that there was I want to say a priest or preacher that led it. And so when people had encountered police, especially in Black communities, they would show up to the scene and kind of console the families and kind of calm them down in the situation so that they didn't have fear. And then there were 2 other groups that would do that as well, but it was mostly for Black families encountering police in communities where they were experiencing a lot of police
Yes,
issues.
I think that was Reverend Paul Abernathy and his group in the Hill District.
Yeah, I think that's exactly who that
Yeah,
was.
they do tremendous work.
that's such an interesting idea and solution. I think this kind of goes to what we had talked about before at the beginning of policy versus programming, and the government can do both, but in a lot of scenarios, it's community organizations who are producing the gold standards of programming because they're so close to the community. And then it's up to the government to then listen to those community organizations to understand what they need in terms of policy. So the mobile trauma group, it sounds like programming, but I could see how in some way it could, get turned into a policy like police officers provide a referral to mobile trauma groups when they know that they've interacted with a citizen who seems to be in distress. Something like that could be definitely a policy that comes out of understanding this. That's a really good example.
Oh, thank you, Natisha, for that. And I just wanted to also add, there's a culture, it's not just culture, it's actually embedded in policing policy. There's a very deep hierarchical culture where the officers that have served the longest are usually, first of all, the most protected, but also the most respected. And I think one of the things that we could write as a possible solution for officers making decisions without awareness of the diversity of the citizens they protect is to make sure that you have buy-in from the people who are most respected among the officers, even if that doesn't mean they have the title to match. I think that's very important.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, in addition, sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
No, go ahead.
Now, I was going to stick to what Sister Janice talked about earlier. So the city had passed an unbiased policing policy, right? So that's what speaks to the fact that police officers cannot interact with ICE, right? It was not just lip service. It was also something that was instituted into the city with buy-in from, of course, our chief of police to make sure that we were intentional in not interacting with ICE. And something else that Councilman Strasberger mentioned in terms of police officers, and something that we have conversations with, both with our city HR and with our friends in police is making sure that the police officers are reflected, they're police officers that are a reflection of the community. So how are community members also police officers? How are they also EMS? How are they also fire? But being intentional about hiring people in the community so that they see themselves in public safety as well.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say I had to drop off for a second because I lost power at my house. So I've rejoined. I'm back on on my phone. But I did, before I dropped off, I did get a question as a direct message, basically saying, asking the question about, new policies might not always be the answer. Sometimes to the earlier slide, changing existing policies might be the answer, although they might not be as garner as much attention. They might not be as popular or widely recognized. That those might be the answer too. And this person was asking specifically about, say the very sort of complex and hairy issue of working with the police union and changing those laws and those policies, or working around ID laws. And I think that's a good point. I mean, and in the case of the current moment and talking about policing and public safety, I think we are presented with the opportunity to consider all options, whether or not they are big and splashy, or whether they are more in the details and not going to be noticed by many people, but will make a big impact. And I think all have to be on the table. Once I have the opportunity to do so, I'd be happy to share a link to kind of a public safety statement and document and paper on my website on City Council District 8 that outlines all of the panoply of options we have for both policy and regulation changes. Some of that have to happen at the city level, but some that have to happen at the state level. And when it comes to the police union, there's some that we can do at the city level in terms of opening up the process and making it more transparent and understanding what the city is asking for when we're in arbitration and when in negotiations for police contracts. But so much of the actual policy around police unions has to happen at the state level in Harrisburg, at the legislature, to help answer that question a little bit.
And Councilperson Strasberger brings up a really good point that I think is worth hitting home around, like, just awareness of the different bureaucracies that exist, even if we're not talking about local versus state, even within the local government level. Some of these issues touch on what the city of Pittsburgh police force can do and has done versus what different police forces that belong to various municipalities in the county have and can do. So just with the ICE example, and I think Sister Janice alluded to this earlier, ICE, our City of Pittsburgh police officers do not cooperate with ICE, but that is not true of many of the municipalities that surround Pittsburgh. And as we know, Pittsburgh is relatively small, so at any given moment, you can find yourself in an area where you're not under City of Police jurisdiction. And then to hit that even further, even if a person from the City of Pittsburgh was to find themselves in jail, was arrested for some reason, once you're in the jail is under county jurisdiction. So once again, you're under new sets of rules, new sets of laws. So it is really complex, it's really complicated, which really emphasizes what Councilperson Strasberger was saying earlier, that good policy takes time. And you do often get that heat of the moment when the entire, city or country is calling for you to do a thing, but you might understand it differently just from the knowledge of the different systems that maybe everyone else does not understand.
Yeah, so we've talked about things that we did manage to put into place. One of them was, I think it was called the Unbiased policing policy related to ICE. And then some of the things that have been done for policing to address knowledge of other cultures is, I believe it's cross-cultural training to try to address the idea that police officers don't No, I think we've actually also kind of gotten into this section a little bit, talking about who do we need to engage when we talk about these. And someone mentioned, what is it? It's the Fraternal Order of Police. For anyone who doesn't know, that's the union for the police. And so when the city makes policies, it has to communicate with the Fraternal Order of Police, who will say back, this is or this isn't reasonable for us to ask of an officer, and there will be a back and forth. So it will be important to engage the Fraternal Order of Police in both of these. Any other um, things that we want to add to who we're going to who we would have to involve in this conversation.
Well, I think we said earlier how important it is to make sure you're listening to the people who are experiencing all of these disparate outcomes, so the community themselves.
Yes. So community members in both cases.
And I'll say on that point, defining the community can become a complex issue as well, because someone might think of themselves as quote unquote the community because they are members or the heads of a community group in a certain neighborhood. Some neighborhoods have 5 community groups. Who's the community in that case? What about people who are, have their heads down, are working 2 or 3 jobs, or have childcare to think about and can't become involved in their local community organizations? What about finding their voices? So that's where I want to also acknowledge that, as government, I think we always have to be thinking of, especially in time of COVID, thinking of the most creative ways to find and seek out the voices that need to be heard, rather than just relying on the traditional paths of communicating with quote unquote the community, because the community can be complex and not monolithic at all.
In addressing the cross-cultural training, I'm not sure if anyone on our panel has an idea, but I'm imagining this couldn't have been, the first city to create such a training program. In fact, I know that the commission had back in the 90s created something like this for police officers, but I think that there was a need to update it. So was there any older policies that, or other cities or counties policies that we looked at to come up with any of these policies?
Oh yeah, I remember us looking at that city in Ohio, Dayton. I remember us looking at their work with the immigrant community within their region, their borders, and how they came up with policy. Yes.
I also think it's important to note that in a lot of this work, as someone who does a lot of research related to a lot of different topics, we oftentimes do look at other cities and what was, successful, because that's oftentimes how you get good ideas. You don't really have to reinvent the wheel every time we have an issue that we know that we need to fix. There are a lot of other cities that have successfully found ways to solve issues that also exist in Pittsburgh. But when we do look at other cities, we do take into account Pittsburgh specific issues that we might have to tweak, for a policy that we looked at in Baltimore or Dayton or New York. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's where, we can get this policy from Dayton, but then we'll need to workshop it with our community here and say, okay, this will and this won't work for who we have living here in the city of Pittsburgh. Also, I think in a lot of times we either contact the mayor's office is a good example, or the city's law department to determine, in Pittsburgh, we have a different some different aspects of our city code. We have our charter, and so when we look at it, what are our limitations as the city of Pittsburgh that are different than what there might be for another city?
I think
I'm sorry, I just wanted to mention in the chat, Beth Pittinger. I was, as I went through the names, Beth, of the participants with us here today, I saw yours and I thought of how important that Citizens Police Review Board was over the years in, trying to interact with police.
Thank you,
Also,
sister.
Yes.
And going off of that, there are many different commissions and groups within the city of Pittsburgh that I think could also I don't know if we can list all of them on this slide, but you have several commissions like the Gender Equity Commission, like the Citizens Police Review Board, boards and commissions that do the work of interacting and engaging community members on different levels that I think are important to have as a part of the process. In addition to, I know we just wrote down Office of the Mayor, but also then our council members as well.
Yeah.
I mean, just to address what you said earlier, Jam, and I apologize, guys. We're probably going to have a soundtrack. My son is playing with his toy in the background. But something else, even before that cross-cultural training, there were two things. One was we know that the police department currently has a cultural competency training that they give officers. So what we did was we invited community members to actually see the training. So the trainers in the police performed the training to the community, and there we saw that it lacked a lot, right? It was just very general and didn't give any depth to the community in which they served, right? So that's why that cross-cultural training really came along, because we knew that there was something missing. In addition to that, we actually went down to, again, I apologize for the background noise. We went down to Washington, D.C., right, to actually go and spend a couple of days with the officers down there and see how they were intentional with serving the diverse population that lived in D.C. and during daytime, the others that came in, and to see how thoughtful they were in their approaches, right, to really make sure that that's what we were bringing to the city.
Yeah. And so then, from those policies, I think both of them would have come down to the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police from Department of Safety and then from the mayor's office. Anyone can correct me if I'm wrong. Both of these policies would have been, coming from the mayor's office down to the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police. For those, does anyone want to, I'll have, either Ala or Jordan talk about from the mayor's office, how do policies go into effect, and then for Councilperson Strasberger from City Council's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak specifically. We use the Crown Act as an example. A few slides earlier, that was an initiative or a piece of legislation that originated in our office around what September. We were again, as Jem mentioned, addressing an issue that exists in Pittsburgh, but also nationwide. And so we have quite a few people on the policy team, and we worked directly with the law department to put together a piece of legislation that would protect city residents today, but also for years to come. And so one thing that's really important to note, and when we're talking about creating change through legislation, language is so very important. And somebody also mentioned, that some legislation doesn't need to be created. Sometimes you have to make amendments. And so that's why amendments, are made. Sometimes things need to be changed and tweaked as time moves on. So that was the piece of legislation was introduced to City Council, and then it goes through a process by which it's introduced, there's discussion, and then it's voted on. So actually, this piece of legislation was almost easier to pass at the local level than it would be, say, at the federal level, which speaks to just how important community and local government really is. Like I said, it was passed at the federal level in the House, but the Senate held it up. And we were able to get the Crown Act passed in a matter of weeks, which is really important to note. So it's a fairly, I want to say fairly simple process. Yeah.
And then on the council side, I want to make something that sounds very nitty gritty and in the weeds clear. And that is that if you are to attend a city council meeting and get the agenda or be able to view the agenda for the meeting, it'll look like all policy is being drafted and created by city council members. And it'll look like that because when you look at the agenda, you'll see that every bill is slotted into a committee and every committee is chaired by a different council member. And what happens though is that the vast majority, in fact, of policy that we're voting on every week and discussing every week at Tuesday and Wednesday meetings is developed by someone in the mayor's office or an associated board authority or commission like the Commission on Human Relations that is then brought to council via the mayor's office. It's sent over every Friday afternoon to the city clerk, who then puts it on the agenda. And then it is decided which committee it goes to. So it's not indeed that person, that committee chair who's introducing the legislation. They're just chairing the committee that it flows through. In some cases, a city council member will introduce legislation and it will be introduced in the appropriate committee as well, but it has that council member's name attached to it. So I wanted to just clarify that as well. In some cases, when city council members are introducing legislation, like in the case of non-discrimination on the basis of real or perceived country of origin or language, that was something that we worked with the Commission on. They're expert in law to determine how best to introduce it, who to involve. I think they had done a lot of the groundwork, but we also had conversations about using it as an opportunity to get the word out to the affected communities that you don't need to put up with discrimination. This is something that you can actually file, and we have the Commission on Human Relations you can go to as you need to, and just had those kinds of conversations in the process of introducing it, so it could kind of get as much play and press as possible to ensure that people were aware of that. And but in some cases, like with the Crown Act, that came over from the mayor's office. We saw it on the agenda on Friday afternoon before the Tuesday meeting. It was introduced. It was then discussed, not the next day, but the week later on Wednesday meeting, and then passed finally the following Tuesday. And so that we had kind of 2 weeks to discuss it, to think about it, to talk to the mayor's office if we had questions. Interestingly enough, when the media comes to someone, they come to the city council who's considering it. So I actually had to give a statement to the media on the Crown Act. And I said, please, please, please talk to the people in the mayor's office because they are the ones who actually introduced it. And so making that distinction is sometimes challenging, and I wanted to make that here.
That's actually, I'm really glad you said that, because somebody in the chat, I think it was Natisha again, this was a really good point. It's important to know who has what deciding power so that people are talking to and approaching the right person. So that was just a perfect example. Oftentimes, because of the nature of the structure of the city and county government, people are unsure who to approach regarding certain issues. And so hopefully this clarifies that sometimes when you're dealing with an issue at the city level that you think might be at the city level, sometimes it's appropriate to approach someone in our office, or it might be more appropriate to approach someone in council, or you might have to go to the county level. But I've found myself that it can be very easy or it can be very hard to distinguish who I should approach to solve an issue, or even to just ask a question. So that was a really good point.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm reminded of, and so I put departments and organizations on here. yeah, it's important to know who has deciding power. So citizens can work with a department like mine, or ONB, or sorry, Office of Management and Budget, or another office to create legislation, but there will be places where departments aren't decision makers. You know, it will go through the legislative process with legislators and the executive branch, like Councilperson Strasberger described. And you know, there will be places, areas that we can't touch. I remember, you know, someone came to me to ask me, or not me, came to the commission to ask about, you know, creating a policy of sovereign citizenship for someone's, you know, proclaimed national origin, and that begins to go beyond, you know, what the commission can touch as what's defined and as a protected class, and then you know it may also go beyond what the city can touch and how we determine sovereignty. So there will be problems that require a multi-level solution. So I'm going to go to here just to remind us about this policy cycle. We're talking about all these three yellow circles, talking about how we're identifying the problem, how we develop the problem, how we get it to the adoption stage. But once it gets past that, we will still have to go through looking back and seeing how did this policy work out? Is it working the way that we want it to? And can we evaluate it? How can we evaluate it to make sure that it's achieving the effect that we needed it to? So I wanted to go to this slide and talk about barriers to access. And I think, you know, we have a lot of initiatives set up uh, in the broader city of Pittsburgh to address barriers to access, but there are still some that, of course, that we won't know about. So we wanted to give this time to talk about barriers to access. Which ones can we identify? If there are any that that you as participants in this can identify that we haven't thought of. You know, I think Councilperson Strasberger brought up time restraints or, you know, capacity restraints on individuals. When you're thinking about how can I, as one person, create this whole policy, initiate this whole policy change. When I have a job and I have kids and my shift is, you know, 11 to 7, so I've got to sleep during the day, you know, there are barriers there. One of the things that we discussed in some of our conversations before this, you know, how community organizations try to fill that gap in terms of being in contact with citizens who, and the community organization can then take that problem to a legislator. That's one of the ways that CASA has worked, especially when we look at the citizenship status protections. So I'm going to throw it out to the group. Any barriers to access and solutions that you've seen, or if you haven't seen this solution to a barrier to access, but wanted to make sure that it's on this page and on the radar.
Well, the leadership of city council persons is really incredibly important. I know in my council district, which is number 4, we had Natalia Rudiak, and oh my gosh, she just was so involved and looked for ways to learn from the community and be present in the community. And then I've seen other council persons, not in my district necessarily, that seem to be only interested in their own opinion. So the leadership of a city council person, at least in the way we operate here in Pittsburgh, can be either a barrier or an invitation.
And on that note, we unlike Philadelphia and other cities, don't have any at-large council members. So we don't actually have any council members who aren't just in a district. And there's a, you know, when there's a call for something that is maybe going to affect someone else's council district disproportionately, or something that is maybe going to affect communities affected by that, you know, are disproportionately in a certain council district, Yeah, we don't have that kind of representation, unfortunately, and it makes it sometimes difficult for well-intentioned council members to want to pass certain policies. I'll just note that as a quick aside.
Mm-hmm.
I know we are, we have about 15 minutes left. Jan, would you like us to move into the next part, or would you like us to just go into Q&A? I know some people are already typing in the chat.
Yeah, we could go into the next part. Somebody mentioned that I think the next part could be useful in terms of answering questions. So we could go to the next part. I do see someone said the length of public meetings. That's interesting. It's hard to commit to the time. Yeah, I would encourage people to continue as they think of barriers to access to continue to put them in the chat, because we will be reading it. And if there's something that we aren't aware of, or if you have a solution that perhaps we as the city of Pittsburgh government haven't thought of, which I'm sure is definitely the case, that those are out there, please feel free to put them there. We'll look at them. But someone had asked in the chat about police policy. I'm thinking, can we identify, a problem that we can talk through this process? And I think that will help to answer, what would be some of the solutions we could think of? What are some of the barriers that we might run into? What are the offices that we need to engage? Is there a problem? You can feel free to put it in the chat. It can be any problem that you see in your community.
Also, feel free to unmute your mic and just talk out loud.
While we're waiting for that, if it's okay, I'll just address one of the questions that Chris had mentioned earlier, which was about police funding. And Beth, I know you were really great about answering that in the chat, but I wanted to address that more largely or more broadly. Away from the police and provided it to other services. There were a couple of dynamics at play. I'll just say what we ended up doing was, one, freezing, passing a resolution to freeze any new hiring of police officers. So as officers retire this year, their slots will not be replaced, at least this year. We'll have to reassess for future years, but that was sort of one immediate thing that we did. And two, moving a little bit more than $5 million out of the police budget and into a new trust fund called the Stop the Violence Trust Fund. That is then split between two different offices, one of which is a brand new office within the mayor's office called the Office of Community Health and Safety, which will be working to, over the next year, develop a set of models that we've seen from other cities to be able to respond along with police to certain types of calls. For instance, calls where someone might be having a mental health crisis, someone might be experiencing homelessness, someone might be experiencing an overdose, and help to provide those wraparound services as a social worker or as a trained professional. Perhaps as we study this and look at it over year one and year two, and hopefully grow this program, getting to the point where we've seen other cities be able to send only the social worker out there to address an issue rather than police, and taking police completely away from that, working with our partners at the County Department of Human Services to solve some of those issues upstream before it even gets to police. And same with the new office that was created under the Department of Public Safety, but outside of police. Those two offices will be working hand in hand. And then some of that money will go into our violence interruption program that is existing as well. So just wanted to note that to be able to truly cut police budgets, I think one, we have to figure out who then will be in place to handle some of these calls and some of these needs. To be able to slash the police budget in half in year one you got to answer the question then, well, then who is there in their place to respond to some of these calls? And that's what we grappled with. And then another, just very quickly, last barrier was to be able to fire police officers. If we did that, we would immediately get sued by the police union because they would allege that this is a state that violates the protections of the police union under state law. So that's where it gets into a state issue. I know there were some pretty heated disagreements about whether we could do that or not, given our financial status this year. But those were some of the barriers we were running up against. So happy to discuss some more of that outside of this, and I'll leave my email and my paper on this topic in the chat in just a moment.
I do want to say, so I know Jam just picked up one of the suggestions that one of you had in the chat for identifying a problem. And we're about to just go through the process that we went through with the case study together. And I encourage you to unmute yourself and participate in the conversation. But I do want to point out that the case study that we went over and the other examples of policies we went over were examples of policies that were already implemented. And so the solutions have already been identified and we're just presenting about them. Whereas when this topic we're talking about here, accountability for officers, it is not something that anyone has figured out. And so it's going to be a different process. It's very easy to talk about a case study where we already have the answers, but I'm sure, as just Sister Janice will tell you, who's been doing this work since 2003, it has not been easy to get some of these policies pushed. People's lives are always at stake. So none of this is easy. I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, that's definitely the case here. And so what I put here is one thing I put is knowledge of accountability mechanisms. And I think, I won't be alone. I know Beth Pittinger was here, and the commission can take on police accountability when it comes to what might be disparate application of a policy. But there are two problems, I think, that are there. The first is that I'm not sure all citizens know of our organizations within the government and how to use us and how to access us. And then, I think there are powers. We just did, the city passed a referendum to expand our powers in this area, but there are still barriers to our powers. And I think Councilperson Strasberger addressed it, saying, whatever policy we do make, we need to communicate that with the Fraternal Order of Police, and there needs to be a discussion back and forth. So that can affect and shape the policies that we're able to create. Other solutions to creating accountability for police officers, we have the Citizen Police Review Board, which is the entity that reviews police misconduct. We have the Commission on Human Relations. So one of the things that was in the chat, it said, police shooting Black people without responsibility. If we add in that element of Black people, then we say it's a disparate application of a use of force policy. And that's something that the commission could investigate. Any other solutions?
May I say something?
Mm-hmm.
It's Beth. One thing that we should all be aware of, and we should be speaking to our elected representatives about, is the concept of qualified immunity. That is where the impunity comes to police and other public officials when they do something that appears to be wrong, morally wrong, or perhaps we see it as being legally wrong, but there's no accountability. That's the idea of qualified immunity, and that has to be dealt with. It was created by the courts, but legislators, and I'm sure that Ms. Strasberger can reinforce that, the legislators make the rules, the courts interpret them, and qualified immunity has to be addressed if we expect to see some accountability on a legal level when incidents such as was described, a police officer encountering and that encounter ending up fatal, when there's a racial element to it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, having our commissions, and I think also um, our law department, I think having our commissions as a resource for people who, not every citizen is able to do their legal research and do this, but our commissions can. So if there's something like a policy like this that's complicated by many factors, it's our jobs to kind of look into this. Also, I think when we also talked about the office of the mayor, which will be the mandate body for policies within the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police. So they can also do this type of analysis. So engaging one of those commissions or one of those bodies can be a place to say, this problem. I need you to do the research to help us to create a policy. I'll put for stakeholders to engage. The person specifically mentioned Black people. So that means when we create this policy, there should be Black people involved in the creation of this policy. If we make a policy, we don't ask any Black people. I mean, luckily, if you can look across our panel, we can see that our city government is diverse and contains Black people. However, that's not enough. We do also want to hear, community members engaged in this process. So that's an interesting idea. Can we make funding reliant on police goals? So goal-based funding. That's a really interesting idea. So based on, police, the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police reaching certain goals, or based on them not meeting certain goals, can we base funding around that? That's a really interesting, idea and solution. So if we were to do that, all office of the mayor, legislators, and the office of budget management and budget would be places that we want to engage, looking at what that could be.
And I'll just say that for that, I mean, yes, we should be doing that. The majority of the police budget, the vast majority, we have two different budgets each year, the operating budget and the capital budget. The operating budget is for salaries and everything associated with salaries and people, and the capital is everything having to do with like everything else. So like building a bridge or, materials for police. In the police budget, the vast majority is taken up by operating budget and salaries. And that is something that, again, council cannot touch. That is decided upon through police arbitration between the union, the Fraternal Order of Police, and the mayor's office, and then decided upon by three judges, three arbitration judges. So I think in my mind, I keep coming back to, until something changes in Harrisburg, opening up that process, making it more transparent and involving people in that process, and alerting them to the fact that it exists, and that's where a huge amount of the budget is decided upon, is important. And one thing that as a policy that I'm looking at to borrow from Philadelphia and currently investigating is mandating that prior to a contract being signed, there has to be a public hearing. And that would be an opportunity for the mayor's office to provide, to the extent that they can, what they are asking for in the negotiations, whether it has to do with police discipline, whether it has to do with, raises, whether it has to do with salaries, whether it has to do with anything that is subject to that conversation, that arbitration process. Making it more transparent, I think, is really, really important for the public to understand what both sides are asking for, and provide more understanding and shine a light on it. So that's one thing that we can do.
Yeah, I know we're
Oh God, sorry, Jam, go ahead.
coming to the end of our time. Hopefully this small version of this exercise has been useful. I love that we came up with such creative examples, the goal-based funding. This is a process that you can take and use. It doesn't have to be government. This process can be used by a nonprofit to determine what stakeholders they need to engage, or by a citizen to say, okay, how do I get my idea all the way to my legislator or to a city department. So hopefully we provided a couple of useful, tactics. I want to say definitely, I can say for myself, I think for most of the panel, we're definitely open to continuing this conversation. It's a small amount of time to address a large concept. So, as we move forward, feel free to, I'm going to put my email in the chat. And as we're getting ready to close, I just want to say thank you to all of the people who have participated in the on the panel and in the audience. That your suggestions and your questions have been so useful.
Thank you so much for the participation from everyone.
Eventually, I believe you'll have a way of getting this PowerPoint. We'll provide it to the Racial Justice Summit to try to get back out to you. I will figure out how to use the chat momentarily, and I'll put my email in there. You can reach me at that email for anything discrimination related in the city of Pittsburgh. I'm happy to help you walk through it, even if my office can't address it. We can try to point you in the right direction.
And Jam, we also have the resource page that we designed specifically for folks, so that I know that Councilperson Strasberger already kind of left her information, but we have a list of resources for you guys to reach out to Casa San Jose, Welcome Pittsburgh, Citizen Review Board, and find out more details about those entities and ways you could get involved as well.
Yeah, and I will say, sorry, that's what I meant to say when I was saying you'll have this PowerPoint, is there is this slide, and some of these are government offices, but some of them are not. There are a lot of nonprofits. Actually, Pittsburgh Foundation isn't on there, and that's another one. There are a lot of nonprofits and community organizations that work with the city already or create policy already. So I would definitely encourage you to engage with them, especially if you're a person who doesn't have a lot of time to sit around in your living room at night to engage in policy. There are people at the city government level and in community organizations who that's our job, and so we want to do this work with your input. Well, on that note, I guess we'll close out. If there are any lingering questions, I don't know that this Zoom meeting room is being used for anything. So I think, everyone is welcome to stay on and put a question in the chat or send us an email later on. I know that there are more panels that are great that people have to head off to. But this has been really great. And again, thank you to everyone who's participated.
Thank you, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.